All right, everyone, welcome to the Performance Advantage Podcast webinar series. So we're going to do a 6-part webinar series teaching you more in-depth, kind of more, I guess we'd call it more sciencey, sports science topics. So we're going to do this in a 6-part series of really important topics that we think apply to all sports, and we want to help you learn these so that you can have more fun and race better.
That's right. So these are going to be available as just an audio podcast and also on YouTube, so you can check out all the slides and articles that we're referencing.
Yeah, cool. So this first one's on pacing, and it's we have done a podcast before on pacing, and that one's been really popular. And this time we want to get more into it, into the nitty-gritty and how it applies to lots of different sports, but also be able to show those visuals. So check out those visuals, listen to this in the car, and then if you want to check up on some of the things that we showed, go check it out on YouTube later. Performance Advantage Podcast on YouTube.
All right, and thanks to our sponsors, Endurance Training Hub and Smart MTB Training. All right, pacing. Matt, this has to be one of your favorite topics, along with pretty much anything else relating to power meters, brake power meters, and energy expenditure across a start finish.
Yeah, I guess like the good thing about pacing is that pacing encompasses all those things: energy systems, power meters, and pacing.
Yeah, and tech. I love it. Love a good piece of sports tech.
Yeah, yes. This was always something that I looked forward to lecturing on, is pacing, because it brought together all of those things. So we've just kind of adapted some of that real, like, actual lecture stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, within the pacing, it's huge. It really is. But what we want to get across within this kind of webinar podcast is, like, why does pacing matter? What kind of pacing strategies are there? Like, what does good or bad pacing look like? And how can you apply a pacing strategy towards your next race or training session? Why would you say pacing matters?
Well, the best argument for pacing is that as humans, we're not like a gasoline engine. So we have just a limited supply of energy, and we have a limited ability to go over a certain threshold. So I guess you can kind of think of that like your car, where you can only hit the revs so high before you're like, oh yeah, I can't go any harder. But then you can keep going until you run out of fuel. But with your car, you can go for I don't know, but like humans can only go for a short amount of time. So we need to figure out like how to get the most out of ourselves in that set amount of time or distance.
Yeah, with it, like, we have blowing up, cracking, hitting the wall, whatever you want to call it. Like, we've been there. We've all been there. And it's kind of, how did you get there? Why did you get there? And because a lot of people are going to look at it through a few different lenses. I guess, like, how I used to look at it, Matt, was I wasn't training hard enough. I was maybe not fresh enough. I was definitely good enough, in my own head. And the reason I slowed down was I had not done enough speed or hard training or race specific training.
Same for me. So I remember I could, thinking, cause at our local races, these guys from the Trek Volkswagen team would show up, which was like the team. And I could start and I could keep them in sight at the start. I was like, man, if only I could just keep doing this. Like, I just need to get better at starting. And I'm like, well, now that I think back, I'm like, well, obviously they were just way better than me. So there was no point in trying to hold on to them at the start, because that just actually led to me racing worse. So yeah, I think, once we can get a good handle on pacing, we can actually get the most out of ourselves.
Yeah, that was like exactly the same for me, where if we ever look at these pacing strategies, the like positive pacing, which is kind of you start fast and get progressively slower.
Yeah, that's pretty much everyone.
Yeah, we are. You have this kind of perception of your ability, And generally that does not align with actual ability or physical capacity. And yeah, it's such a trap because in especially endurance sports, or pretty much anything lasting longer than 10 minutes, the first part of the race, the first quarter, is within your physical capabilities, well within. And so it's like, yeah, this feels comfortable, especially if you've tapered well. And so you just get drawn into this trap of like, maybe this is the day.
Yeah.
This is the day where I do something extraordinary.
I always think about positive pacing as like the most painful way to race. So positive pacing, remember, is when you start out really hard and then you gradually slow down. And this is what we all do. And it feels like the way that you're supposed to be racing. So you start off as hard as everyone else does, and you just make the race as painful as possible. So it just sounds like it's really going to hurt, right? But you're going slower and you don't realize it because it's just as hard as the start was, because you're just suffering and digging deep the whole time.
Yeah, so that's like graph A on this on the slide that we're showing. So you start, with the power velocity really high and it finishes really low. But if we had to, it'd be the inverse, right? If you were doing like a RPE, rate of, perceived exertion, where you're like, I'm trying so hard, and for some reason my power meter's not calibrated, or everyone else did something, better than me in training. And yeah, it's
one of the tricky things, because we were training 10 or 15 years ago, we were training with heart rate, and that was kind of the only way. So we'd have this set heart rate zone that we wanted to work in. And if we were doing a 5-minute or 10-minute effort, we'd try and get into that zone really, really quickly. But what that kind of ignores is this delay in the heart rate as it starts to catch up and you hit like a steady state. So what normally ended up happening is positive pacing in those intervals as well, where you start off super hard and then you have to gradually pull back the effort to make sure your heart rate doesn't get out of the zone. It's just such a horrible way of training, and everyone did it. And a lot of the OGs are still training like that. But now that we have power, we know and pace, we know exactly what to do.
Well, even I was showing you my video I'd put up around running power and hill intervals. So pace is irrelevant running up a hill. How do you, what's 5% versus 7% gradient? Pretty hard to tell. My heart rate took 5 minutes to catch up on this 20-minute climb. So it's you're essentially running blind. You're like, how does this feel? Good? I don't know. Is it 6 or 7 RPE out of 10 kind of thing? But I had a running power meter, so I just stuck with that, and it showed how consistent the effort was start to finish. Because once you know kind of your physiological limits, like we're going to talk about, you know the percentages within which you can work to those limits. And so that's going to help with some of these other pacing strategies we're showing here, like parabolic, variable, even. Even's probably the hardest to do, but the most effective.
Yeah. We'll talk about that. Yeah, I have some new thoughts about even pacing strategies, actually.
Oh, really?
Yep.
And yeah, so the U shape, it's most probably the what most people are ending up doing a lot of the time, where you start fast because that's just how it kind of goes, and then you quickly recalibrate, oh no, that was too fast, and you slow down to a more appropriate intensity or output, and then you get the end is in sight and you have the capacity to speed up. So
yeah, because you took a nice little snooze in the middle of the race because you were recovering. All right, well, let's go into, because we're going to get into all of these pretty in depth.
Yeah.
So, okay, so here we are. This slide shows negative pacing, and I think this graph, I actually can't remember. The citation's on the graph from a research study, so it kind of shows a track cycling event, and it's pretty steady early on, and then at the end it's really hard, really high pace, high power. So that's negative pacing, where you start pretty slowly and get faster as you go. And I always really loved racing that way. Once I figured out about pacing, and I figured I didn't have to start with the fastest people, but I could start to catch them closer to the end. I would do negative splits. So that's negative splits, this negative pacing.
It's not named well, is it? Like negative pacing?
It's like, oh.
And positive pacing is,
Yeah.
We can come up with better names, but that's what they are.
Well, this is made by mathematicians, so it makes sense.
They don't care about practicality.
No.
It's the beauty of numbers.
Like, the numbers are there. So, yeah, negative pacing is awesome. Like, you can start off pretty easy and get faster as you go. And by the time you finish, you're finishing totally spent anyway. If you're able to use practice to time it appropriately. And it just feels pretty good. Like, pretty good the whole time. And your lap times get faster. It feels really good to catch people at the end of a race. And it doesn't feel so good to be the one getting past.
Yeah. No, whenever I do an event where I've paced like extremely well, especially, the ultra endurance events, which it becomes even more applicable because of the bandwidth at which you can kind of go above and beyond or below even like your capacity really diminishes throughout the event. Being able to have that mental and physical capacity to just push at the end is like nothing else, like it's hurting all the same, but you are actually either maintaining speed or speeding up. You're not slowing down or like absolutely suffering just to continue to move forward. So yeah, like and the reason is because you have this like physiological capacity that you've reserved for the event. Like you've just paced your resources well. Whereas, and like reference to other kind of pacing strategies, you're not doing that. Like we only have kind of, like Matt was saying at the top of the show, a finite capacity being humans, whether that's to store heat, whether that's glycogen, whether that's like your lactate buffering or acidic, the amount of acidity you can withstand, your breathing rate or ventilation rate. So there's like these kind of limiting factors, and if you aren't kind of taking those into account within your pacing strategy, then yeah, you could end up going slower or worse, like stopping.
Yeah, so now I guess we're talking about like all out pacing. And it's pretty much the worst idea for pretty much anything you do, except like a 100-meter sprint. So you think about Usain Bolt, if he started off really slowly, or he's like, yeah, you know what, this 9 seconds is a pretty long time. I'm just going to like cruise into this one. Most of like the time that can be gained in a 100-meter sprint is at the start where you're totally standing still. Like you're actually not moving, right? When the gun goes off, you're still not moving. And then you need to get up to speed as quick as possible. And that's the hardest part. So that's where you need to expend the most energy. So if you think about your 100-mile run or your cross-country mountain bike race, the same concept applies, but you have so much time to make up that deficit. You have more than 100 meters to make up that deficit. You have 20 Ks or something, or 100 Ks, right? In the 100K run. So you have plenty of time. So you don't need to worry about going all out. And I know people, especially mountain biking, talk about how important the start is because of the single track, and it's really difficult to pass. But if you actually break it down and you look at analysis by laps, you don't stand to lose that much time on the first lap. So it's about finding that mix, because it is really hard to pass.
Oh, but like we've seen, you got me into when you first moved to New Zealand, like watching the cross-country mountain bike racing on Red Bull TV. And so this is the World Series, like the best riders in the world. And even from that, there are standout riders within the world. And you see them crash at the start, slip a pedal, get a flat tire on the first lap, and they're back in 100th or whatever. Like some crazy play. They move all the way up throughout the race into the podium or at least the top 10. So it shows
the best are the best.
Yeah,
right.
The capacity's there. So if you're trying to ride with the best at the start, you don't.
They're already better than you. So like that's the important thing to remember is they are like that much better. So they can maintain. They're not going all out at the start. Nino Schurter at the start of the World Cup cross country isn't going all out as much as the guy that's 10 seconds behind him that's going to finish 100th. So
yeah. And with this, like looking at the all-out pacing slide, all-out pacing is really a matter of accelerating, right? Getting up to a certain velocity so that either inertia in cycling, track cycling, you're talking about like the flying lap or something like that, is going to be able to be maintained, where the amount of energy required at a certain velocity is not as much as getting up to that velocity. Because if you were going to, whereas, you mentioned like a 100K run, the capacity for you to get up to whatever, like 10 Ks an hour, requires about 10 meters and a minimal amount of energy. And even if it took 20 meters, you have the next 99.98 kilometers to compensate for that extra 20 meters that it took.
You got plenty of time. So I guess the classic example on that slide is I showed the basilisk, the Jesus lizard that runs across the water. He has to use all-out pacing to get across the water, but you don't, right? So if he didn't use all-out pacing, he would just sink. But we don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, positive pacing. Oh, yeah. I mean, it does work sometimes. So positive meaning the progressive slowing down.
Yeah, so you start out hard and you get slower as you go. And so this is practical for some events. And usually what we say is, it's in terms of energy systems and the time that we would have to make up, and like the ability to make up time in events. Like we should use positive pacing or all-out pacing in a way in anything under 3 minutes. So above that, positive pacing isn't going to, like where the acceleration isn't super important, positive pacing isn't going to be a huge benefit in anything over 3 minutes.
Yeah, like even you're mentioning here thermal stress. Trying to, I don't really like the term like get ahead, because it's kind of what a lot of people say, especially in running, like, I'm going to bank time early. It's generally how positive pacing starts out. Like, if I bank some seconds ahead of like what I anticipate to do, by the time it really hurts at the end, I have the capacity to slow down. And it's proven time and time again in the literature everywhere that that's not how it works. Like you can maybe, yes, at certain distances and speeds, you need to, like we said, accelerating requires a certain amount of energy to get up to speed. And that's where the U-shaped pacing comes into effect, where you exert a lot to get up to speed, revert back to probably your more appropriate intensity, and then you accelerate at the end because you have the capacity to do so. Where you may be able to get ahead, especially in like a 3-minute event, 800 meter track run, is get ahead of the inevitable fact that you're going to be heating up, and at a certain temperature, you're forced to slow down. Whatever that reason is, it's not open for discussion in this, because whether it's
we can do a webinar series on like muscle mechanics and like the heat and muscle metabolism. That'd be actually a really good webinar series where we talk about how the heat increases and the friction with the sliding filaments. We can get into that. That's not for this though. But actually, what's happening in you are heating up, and that's just what happens when you're doing work. The hotter you get, the sooner your power is going to reduce. And we obviously want to try and avoid that, but it does happen. But also one thing about positive pacing is we tend to see this in ultra endurance events, like the ones that you do, Will. But there's also, as you said, there's not a lot of research on ultra endurance sports. So we'll see actually what you do for your 24-hour run.
Yeah, this is so it's more of a neuromuscular fatigue as opposed to like a draining of resources, where you're going to slow down. You want to run for 24 hours, you're going to slow down. There's a capacity to speed up, almost like defies physics, physiology. So because like your muscles are just deteriorating across like being activated for that amount of time. So there's so much damage that you don't have the capacity to fully recruit those muscles. So the force output is declined. But there is a means of reducing the rate at which you slow down, and whether that's what you start at, how you pace it in terms of like run, walk, or something like that, or your conditioning within your training as well. But for even within ultra endurance events like 100k, for maybe not like a super technical trail or mountainous 100-kilometer run, something with more runnable, it is very I wouldn't say common, but expected for the best of the best, the world class, who are doing around 8 hours, to run start to finish almost even pacing. Because around 8 hours, we see this in Ironman, especially. That's the best guys and girls, 8 to 9 hours. It appears like the physical capability of an individual, a well-trained professional individual, to sustain a certain output for that duration is physiologically capable. Like you can do that. Now, I don't know, like, have you done 6 hour mountain bike, you've done 12-hour mountain bike races, Matt?
Yep.
So what's happening there? Like, because there's not the same muscle damage as there is for running, like, were you able to maintain lap times?
Yeah, usually for 6 or 12 hours, you can be pretty consistent. But what ends up happening is when it's that long, the light changes. So there's like this weird mix of things that is happening. Like, so the trails are getting darker, but you know them better, kind of thing. So there's a certain time where you're maybe going faster without any more effort, just because you know what's coming up. But then eventually you can't see, but then you know it even better.
Yeah.
But there is a bit of slowing. For sure. For those, like, even pacing is obviously going to be good. So if you look at the race as a whole, like even lap times. But then within a lap, there's so much going on within it, like uphills, there's downhills, and you need to be able to disperse your effort appropriately across the entire track and in the entire race to make sure that you can have even lap times.
Yeah, and like something I just did yesterday, Matt, I did a 50k training run, and I live in Rotorua. The forest here is really hilly, undulating, and I had 5-kilometer lap times on my watch. I kind of knew the course I was running, and so it was about exerting a certain amount of effort across time. Because I was running for 4 hours, the taking a lap sort of 20 to 25 minutes and making sure and I was looking at, average pace, average heart rate, average power kind of thing across that duration was more appropriate than looking at what most people would have is like every kilometer, or every 5 minutes or something, because that might be just downhill or just uphill.
Yeah,
but
right.
So it's kind of a way of like a very simplistic way of normalizing an effort, which would be more appropriate in something like mountain biking.
When I think about things that are off-road, we might be thinking about it as even or negative pacing, but actually I think more appropriate is, like, within the lap is variable pacing, where we're adjusting our effort based on usually the terrain. So one of the classic examples is a cycling time trial. So you imagine that you're in the cycling time trial and it's out and back. So you go out one way, you turn around and you come back the same way you came. But there's a wind and there's a headwind on the way out. So if what you did in this race was apply an even pacing strategy and you sat at your FTP or your power that you're going to maintain, and you maintain that the whole time, you'd actually go slower than if you overpaced a certain part of the race. So you would want to overpace and to try harder into the wind because you're going slower. So because you're going slower, you actually have more time that you can make up, right? So the average speed's lower, bring that up just a little bit, and you go faster overall. Because once you go fast with the tailwind, going harder isn't going to do a whole lot for you because of the drag, as the drag increases when you start to push harder. So in this case, what you want to do is you want to go over your FTP into the headwind and then under it into the tailwind.
Yeah, because it's kind of like the trade-off of, if we say energy input versus speed output.
Yeah.
Right? Or the, change in the delta, the change in speed you'd get from the added input or reduced input on the way back into the tailwind.
Yeah. And this is exactly what we're doing within a lap, right? Of say you're doing your 100K run and you do 10K laps, and there's an uphill and a downhill in each one. So you're not going to run evenly down the hill as you are up the hill. You're going to probably try harder up the hill and then maybe recover a little bit on the downhill. Is that even possible?
No, see, that's where it becomes super complex because within an ultra, you're kind of running pretty slow, relatively. So to push hard on a hill, depending on the incline and your fitness level, can be like drastic to get 2 minutes, 3 minutes, even on a really long. You might be running or putting a large amount of effort to gain 1 minute per kilometre, and a 5-minute hill is huge. And so to get 5 minutes, the downs become so technical and so physically demanding because of the eccentric loading. That's where you can make time by having a greater capacity to push on the downhill. You can easily get, more like 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes per kilometre faster by being more efficient and having a greater energy than you didn't expend going up the hill. And so but very, very different than a cycling time trial where, again, that energy input versus time gained or speed, velocity, is a different relationship than it is in running.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting because I've been thinking a lot about this pacing on hills, just up a hill. And we might think like, okay, well, it's a hill, it's steady, we know how long it is, let's use even pacing. But actually, what you probably want to do is use variable pacing or even kind of negative pacing up one steady hill. And that's because of the bottom of the hill, you're already going pretty fast. So by putting in this massive effort at the bottom, when you're already going pretty quick, you should probably just ride slowly at the start when you're going fast, and then pick up the effort at the top of the hill to go even faster. So there's ways that we can use variable pacing even within an even pacing strategy.
Yeah,
overall.
And it, with this slide, it shows that they did a cycling time trial and simulated with different headwinds and tailwinds, and variable pacing came out, significantly faster with reduced effort.
Yeah.
Overall.
Yeah, it's a pretty big surprise. So normally you'd think the thinking was, you just go steady in a time trial, but by having a variable pacing strategy and setting it, they were faster overall with a lower power output than their initial test. So it was an easier effort and they went quicker. So that's pretty cool. And then this that graph kind of shows all the variables that they found, or everything that they measured. So I guess what they looked at, so they have power output. Let's see. So the initial time trial was 235 watts. Constant power output was 234 watts. And variable power output, these are all averages, or it's 235 watts. So it's all pretty much the same. But then if you look at finish time, the variable power output was 12 seconds faster, which is actually quite a lot in this test. So over
for 16 kilometers.
Yeah, which is great. So it just shows that power didn't really change overall, but the way that they expended their energy did, and that's what led to a faster time.
Yeah. So W prime, Matt.
Yeah. Oh man.
Anaerobic work capacity.
Yeah. So this one, this is one of my favorite topics as well. So critical power. So with critical power, if we know what your steady state is and we know how long you can maintain it, we also can figure out how hard you can go before you blow up. So it's just like a way to model your power and figure out like where you should be using your energy. So this graph, like, it shows the equation, which doesn't really matter because you probably can't plug it into your calculator. You can program it into something though, and you can see like as you go really hard and as you go over your FTP, this W prime, which is this work capacity to go over critical power, starts to reduce. So we go hard, and then our ability to be able to continue to go hard is kind of shrinking, and we don't know that. We can't tell that, but it is, and eventually we won't be able to do it. So this is just like a nice way to model that. But then if you go easy, that kind of that battery recharges. So this is when we start to think about variable pacing, or and being able to regenerate down the hills if we can reduce the effort. But eventually you're going to have to go hard again and blow up. And then you won't be able to go hard anymore.
Yeah, so it's like that with that nebulous threshold. And so it's kind of a simplistic, very simplistic view of it is above that you have, let's say, 100 units, anaerobic work capacity units. If you go above that, you start to take away your units. If you go 1% above it, you're taking, let's say, 1 unit per minute. And then, but if you go, 100% above it, you kind of reduce all your units within that 1 minute. And so you have to slow down. Now, if you were to go 50% above it and then stop or coast down a hill, you may be 100% below it again, and you can regenerate maybe at 0.25%. Rather than not the 1%, it's not 1 for 1, but we all know you can smash yourself up a hill on a bike, coast down the other side, and you feel better. That's goes without saying kind of thing, but you're not going to be at the bottom of the hill, you're not going to be in the same physical state as you were previously before climbing that hill. But there is a definite recovery. And so what Matt's kind of saying is, and in the graph, if you're looking at it, there's a green line, and the green line shows after each effort the decline in your anaerobic work capacity all the way to like the end of what looks like some kind of 20-minute time trial, and then a recovery, active recovery, where the green line starts to increase again, and there's begins to be another work capacity to be able to do. And that's important. Like, it's important to remember if you are heading out in whatever kind of race or time trial you're doing, if you know that you're really trying to push to get beyond your limit, if you start out too far, you are using up those 100 units, and you want to have 10, 20 units left by the end. And if you're using them at a faster rate than is like the duration of your event, you're going to blow up, and you're going to have to slow down drastically because you now no longer have any units left.
Yeah, so I think actually maybe we can kind of relate this to the parabolic pacing, because that's kind of like what's happening, right? So parabolic pacing is when your pace is really high at the start, and then you have that snooze in the middle, and then you ramp it up at the end, right? Is that kind of relatable?
Yeah, like most people, we're going to start too fast. It's just that, especially at big events, you take off and it doesn't even feel like you're doing anything, and then you'll look at your Garmin or your GPS, whatever, go, oh no, that was a bit quick. I'm gonna pull it back. Or if it's a short event, you realize, you feel the RPE, and you dial it back, and then you kind of get that motivation near the end.
Yeah, or you just kind of conserve the energy, or you regenerate that ability to speed up towards the end.
That's right. That can depend on a lot of things, like especially if you're doing a cycling race, a bunch race where you can sit in. Maybe there's a tax flying from the start, and you got to get in the front bunch. Big climb, whatever it is, there's going to be a large amount of energy exerted. But then come the end, there's going to be a sprint. Right.
Yeah, and you need to be ready.
Yeah.
Right. You can't just like TT the whole way. Right? You're just going to get your doors blown off at the end.
It's just for triathletes who'll just sit on the front of the bunch.
Yeah. It usually doesn't end up well, does it?
No, and then it's the same kind of thing. Like, I was leading the whole way, and then they just sprinted past me.
I can't believe those guys.
Yeah. So what are some of the ways like that we can monitor these things, Matt?
Well, come on. Power meter.
Right.
It's 2020. So like if we are competing at any serious level or if we're putting any energy into our training at all, I believe that you should have a power meter. Right. So you should have a power meter and then you should have a heart rate monitor. So I think everyone pretty much has a heart rate monitor these days.
Yeah.
That's training.
Kind of like default now.
Yeah.
With devices.
Yeah, but a power meter is super important. And if you know your power, you figure out your thresholds, and then you can pace according to your thresholds. So I was talking to someone the other day. They had a new power meter, and he was saying that the data was just like all over the place, and he didn't really know what to do with it. I was like, well, okay. So just very quickly, I gave him this one quick tip, and I said, go out and do this. So he's in the States. 10-mile loop as fast as you can and find your average power. Next time you do that loop, go 10% over that average power up the hills and 10% below it down the hills. And if you're going over 40 miles an hour, just coast. No, maybe it's 40K, something like that. But I was like, this is an easy way to get used to it and to be able to use this power meter for understanding how to pace right away. So hopefully he did that. We'll find out tomorrow.
Yeah, I did the same. I was lucky we had this like a 10K running race, and a few of the athletes I work with and myself, like we all did the first race of the season and just like we were in pieces, Not only was it a hot day, but it was a super competitive race. Everyone went out pretty hard, slowed down. So then and I didn't know the course at all. We had the club one, the local one. We know the course. We've done it a couple of years. We know the wind, you know it. You know how it all pans out. So then with my athletes, it was kind of like one of those ones where it was about 4 laps, and there's like the uphill part, the downhill part, there's a square, and the headwind part and the tailwind part. And it's kind of like, all right, and we start on the uphill part. You're not allowed going over this, okay? And then the downhill, you don't need to worry about pacing because you're just going to be running fast. You're going to be running faster then. It's more about like the headwind and the uphill part that you need to control. And everyone went way like minutes faster than when they like blew up the a couple weeks before. So it's like there's the course knowledge, but also those thresholds are just so important. None of them could believe that. They're like, I can't run 10 seconds per K slower than what I want to average. That just doesn't even make sense. But it's like how much faster they ran at the finish, which was greater than 10 seconds per kilometre, and continuing to like speed up or accelerate towards the finish. That was.
I love it when that works out.
Yeah, especially as a
Always
coach.
Does. Yeah, always does.
And yeah, there's a certain, that's where pace and power would have been even more appropriate for runners, but runners are still getting used to power, how it works. Like it's even the power meter manufacturers for running are adapting their algorithms because it's not a direct measurement like it is with cycling power. And so that's all developing as like here and now. Wow.
Yeah, consumer products take a while. And it takes a while to be adopted. But the power meters for bikes were here in this place like 10 years ago. But now you wouldn't have seen anyone in the tour without a power meter.
Oh, no way. Yeah.
There's just no way. But 20 years ago, none of the pros were using them. Very few. So yeah, we're getting there with running power meters and brake power meters. So
with heart rate, now with ultra running and what kind of ultra events as a whole, heart rate is super important because there can be a large amount of factors, heat and fatigue being two, that can contribute to like a reduction in output. So, because you could be going, yep, this is my power. This is what I want to do. Now, for whatever reason, you're a little bit tired. It's hot and the conditions underfoot or under wheel are not conducive with maintaining like the power output you thought or the pace, the output. So the input then becomes really important, and that is like, what is your what is your heart rate? Like, what are you doing physiologically? How hard are you working relative to your capacity to be able to work? And yeah, as much as you can look at like your thresholds or like your zones, which we've gone over numerous times within our masterclass and within previous podcast episodes, training zones amazingly important. But for ultra stuff, Matt, I often use like historic data, because there can be, being excited, taking caffeine, heat, even like you may be in an ultra having to use a lot of compulsory gear, so you're running 3 to 4 kgs heavier than normal. Now, how much impact does that have in terms of like the rate at which you're working, but actual the demands of everything, like in terms of relation to speed? There's so much that can be going on. It's heart rate can just be so valuable in that instance, and a lot more so than pace for sure. And then later on, heart rate starts to become relevant as maybe it declines. You lose a lot of fluid. Your excitability or stimulatory, like hormones are all declined. So then, if you're running in the night, your heart rate might be really low, but your output good. And that was, something I've noticed a lot. So it is, there's time and place for all of these things. I wouldn't really rate RPE, Matt, would you?
Only if you're going to use it in a negative pacing way, then yes. Yeah, definitely. This is a cool study from Bassan et al., International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance. I think that's a pretty good journal. So I think the what I was really interested in is like because when we did that mountain bike research, remember, like we were studying downhill pacing.
Yeah.
And we're trying to figure out, like, okay, if you coast, like, can you go faster? And it turns out, like, you can go just as fast if you coast down this hill that we used. You can go just as fast if you coast as when you pedal, but you save way more energy when you coast. And so it's like, okay, well, what the heck's happening with skills? So is there something happening as you get tired? Does your skill execution start to change? And I believe that it does happen, like your skill, your ability to do so if you think about juggling and you do like a sprint as hard as you can and then you stop and you do more juggling, my guess is that you would have a harder time juggling at the end than you did at the start. That's because you're tired and there's something happening there with the fatigue and the skill execution. So this was found in swimmers as well in this study. So I think what the swimmers did is they went slightly above the pace that they normally do, and their strokes started to change, and their strokes started to get more poor. So they were swimming a little bit faster, but took exponentially more effort because their stroke was so poor. So there is a relationship between fatigue and skill execution. Yeah,
and that is important in like a majority of sport, team sports especially, but also decision making, which can be impaired. And there's a great reference. We won't play it now, but the Aaron Gwynn winning a World Cup downhill mountain bike race when his chain broke out at the starting gate.
Yeah, loved it. So for the record, we had already started doing the pacing research before this happened, but he did end up like breaking his chain and doing what we did in our research day, but he won a World Cup race with no chain, which is amazing, right?
It is. So, it's incredible. Like the pinnacle of downhill mountain biking, best riders in the world, and he didn't even have a chain. He couldn't pedal.
Yeah. Amazing. So, yeah, then our study didn't get published until 2016. He did that in 2015. But you know how science is. It takes forever for it to get published. So here's a link to that article, but we kind of found those same things, and people were able to maintain a lower heart rate and a lower oxygen uptake just by coasting down this hill, and they didn't go any slower. So that just means the next uphill would have been better, and the uphill after that would have been better.
Yeah, so it goes back to like that anaerobic work capacity, or even just considering it your units of available like outputs, right? Like in Matt's study, he showed if you didn't pedal down the hill, you didn't lose any time, and you gained more units to execute like later on in the race. So overall, it's a win-win.
So we have this fun game that we play, Name That Pace, and so we have like a power file up, and then we draw a line for the person's FTP, pretty much. So that's exactly what's happening in this. I can't remember actually what this one was, but this looks pretty even to me. What do you think, Will? So we see that FTP right there around 300 watts. Does that look pretty even to you?
It does, yeah. Like
Slightly
incredibly
harder in the
variable,
beginning.
but across the board even.
Yeah, but that's just mountain biking. So it's variable in between, right? But overall, I don't know. Maybe it's positive pacing. It's a little hard at the start, isn't it? Like there's much more spikes above FTP at the start.
Yeah. So this file's come from a Training Peaks analysis, and it shows just the power at file and trace, which could be it could be for running as well, which trail running especially becomes like super variable, and that makes it even harder to pace, because how do you pace something that you don't know where, like, what's, that's where running power is still behind in terms of like running downhill. Right, like if you're mountain biking, like there's an eccentric component to anyone who's done mountain biking and smashed a downhill without a lot of pedaling knows you're pretty wrecked by the end of it.
Yeah, well, I always see, like when I look at my riders' files, endurance ride, if they do it on the trails, their heart rate definitely peaks down the hills. So okay, so now this slide shows heart rate and power, and then the same line drawn for FTP. I'm not sure if it's the same race, but what it kind of shows is that the power was probably a little high at the start, but then heart rate was probably exactly where we wanted it. So it kind of, to me, shows an issue in using heart rate for pacing, because your heart rate kind of gets there and it kind of stays there. The pros are able to recover really, really quickly after these hard efforts, but for the rest of us, the heart rate's just going to be pretty steady most of the time. So I think, heart rate in this case isn't a really good indicator of we can't really use it to guide our pacing, is what I think.
All right, so without the hill, just gaining more data, right?
Yeah. So that these slides kind of show, like, we need as much info as we can get. So if we didn't know that this file had a hill in it, we would not really be able to understand the pacing strategy. It just kind of looks, I don't know, I guess kind of even. And then we go to the next slide that shows the actual hill, and like, wow, actually that was a really good pacing strategy. Very variable, but probably beautifully executed.
Yeah, that's right. So how are we going to apply this to your sport? Like, what are you going to be able to do? Most of the people listening would, triathletes, runners, cyclists, mountain bikers, multi-sport athletes, adventure racers. What do we need to consider, Matt, so that we can pace our effort appropriately?
I think you need to consider that it's worth trying a new pacing strategy, right? And that's really the main thing to consider. So if you're considering pacing strategies and you're thinking, I'm just going to do what I always do, you could be doing it better. So I think you should try one of these, and it takes a lot of confidence to be able to try a new pacing strategy. But try one and just see how it goes.
Yeah, I would say do an analysis, or get someone to help you do an analysis of some of your past events. I think I would have to say most people on Strava, a lot of people don't have a more complex means of analyzing their training or racing, like a Training Peaks or something like that. But Strava has it's all the data's there as well. Have a look, like if it's power output or pace or even heart rate, which may decline. You can have a look and see how it was distributed across your event or across your training session. Because if you are doing, an interval session, there's 5 intervals, something 5 by 3 minutes is always a standard kind of one with a couple minutes recovery. If throughout those intervals you can see that your output, whether that's pace or power, is declining, then there's the potential that you went too fast, too hard in the first one. And so looking at that, you can start to go, okay, well, if that's not what I can maintain, I should probably, my event coming up is going to be 20 minutes long and I couldn't do 5 by 3 minutes at this output. I'll try start a little bit lower than that. Maybe more appropriately, like I'll try and start at the power output I held for the last interval and, go off of that kind of thing. And using the demands, like what are the demands of your sport? Because if it's something like an ultramarathon, geez, the slower the better. Really, like you could be very underpaced, if we say that, for 2 hours and then realize, you know what, I'm actually feeling pretty good. Well, you've got 8 hours to catch up.
And you didn't lose that much time, so just get into it. Like, that's fine. You got plenty of time.
Yeah, and something like, you've put skill. Like, if there's a skill component and that skill component becomes important through different areas of your event, so I'm thinking mountain biking downhills, right? There can be a lot of free time, if we can call it that, to be gained through skill.
Definitely. Yeah.
And same with like tactical awareness within like a team sport or even like bunch riding and cycling.
Yeah, I think just try it. And so as a review, we know why we need to pace and we know what kind of pacing strategies we can try. And that'll help us choose the right one for us. Yeah,
and it's important to kind of understand that we have like a finite ability to exercise at certain intensity levels, certain output levels. And so understanding your limitations and the way you can go about that can be, really important in ensuring that you can like perform optimally. And this is just one of the studies we had mentioned. If anyone's interested in like doing runs, ultramarathons and pacing strategies during 24-hour ultramarathons, is I found this interesting, Matt, because the slower you were or the slower you are as a runner, the greater or like the faster you start.
Yeah.
So the more experienced and more capable runners slowed the least.
Yep.
Right? Whereas the less capable runners and potentially less experienced runners slowed the most.
Yeah.
And so they started fastest relative to
so the pros are pretty steady, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So this is 24-hour ultramarathon, the slide that's up here, and everybody slowed. But there becomes a point around the halfway mark. So this is 24-hour pacing, around 12 hours, where you kind of reach your, I guess, critical output. Like, it's an output at which you just sustain from then on. And, this study actually kind of references a level of discomfort you can maintain. So that is, you're 12 hours into a 24-hour event and you kind of just exist in this level of discomfort, which you are capable of maintaining until the end. And that's what it is. All right. And if you would like to learn more about not just pacing, not just your physical capabilities, but also how sports science has been able to help you understand your training and your racing and coaching, and we can offer that to you within our 6-part masterclass, individual modules. Everything's broken down into like 3 to 5 minute videos. There's a certificate at the end and you have lifetime access.
Yeah, so this has been pretty popular with athletes and coaches around the world. So it's been awesome to get their feedback on that and to help everyone just to bring all these concepts together of sports science.
All right, you can check that out on performanceadvantagepodcast.com. Until next time.
See ya.